Now, the oldest parts of the Bible, Genesis chapter 1 through 6, that deal with before the flood, was not written down much earlier than 800 BC. On the other hand, most of the Sumerian stories and legends they seem to have been borrowed from were composed and made public about 2500 BC. That would be well over 1500 years before the Bible was put into written form. The cuneiform tablet versions reported parallel stories that took place long before the Noah event, as well as activities just after. There was a large body of religious literature besides the book of Genesis that deals with this period before this catastrophe. There are such sources like the 3 books of Enoch, the book of Jubilees, the Gnostic teachings, the Dead Sea Scrolls, the oral tradition of the Jews, the rabbinical writings, and the works of Josephus, and many works of unknown authorship that did and do exist. Much of what is not intelligible in these ancient religious writings is explained in part in the large library of available Sumerian, Babylonian, and other cuneiform inscriptions. Remarkably, the Sumerian literature was obviously regarded as historical context and used to support and augmented the books of Moses. There was a changing of names, including God's name to form the Jewish foundational myth. It seems Sumer was the fountainhead for the events and stories of the Pentateuch and the other Western religious writings. As much as biblical apologists have tried to avoid or cloud these issues of the origin of the books of Moses, the historical evidence clearly shows that its origins are in the valley of Mesopotamia. The Sumerian culture can be traced as far back as the beginning of the 4th millennium BC. It seems to be the source of all the myths of the Middle Eastern civilizations that followed. The Akkadian, the Babylonian, and Assyrian people inherited much from the Sumerian culture. This culture was subsequently transferred to the west of the lands of Palestine, Syria, Lebanon, and the Anatolia. When the famous biblical figures Noah and Abraham lived, there was no such thing as a Hebrew in existence. Both Jews and Arabs traditionally claimed descendancy from Abraham, who was neither Jew nor Arab, but a resident of the city of Ur in Mesopotamia. The earliest reference in the Old Testament said to show Abraham's alleged Hebrew ancestry is in yet another error in translation. In their eagerness to provide Hebrew antiquity, translators have incorrectly referred to Abraham as such in Genesis 14. The context where this first appears is in the invasion of the eastern kings into Canaan and Abraham's reaction when his nephew Lot was taken prisoner. And as the text goes, the invaders seized all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their food and departed, taking with them Lot, the son of Abram's brother. Together with his possessions, he had been living in Sodom. A fugitive brought the news to Abraham, the Hebrew, who was camping at the terebinths of Mamre, and the Amorite kingsmen of Eshcol and Aner, these being the confederates of Abram. Evidently, Abram was a stranger in the land at the time, and had just migrated from the city of Ur, so both he and Lot were visitors or travelers. Here's the error. The translation of the word Ibri as Hebrew has no linguistic support. The root bur means to pass through or to cross. So Ibra, as it appears in the text of Genesis, would mean one who is passing through or a visitor. And the news was brought to Abraham that his nephew, his friend and fellow traveler, had been captured by the invaders. Semitic Ibri is obviously related to the Akkadian Hebrew, where it is probably derived. The Akkadian version of the Gilgamesh epic, his friend Enkidu, shares most of his adventures and is referred to as Hebrew. The Chicago Assyrian Dictionary defines it as a relationship between persons of the same code of behavior and the obligation of mutual assistance. The definition fits the situation of Abraham and Lot perfectly.
But he wasn't a Hebrew.
Right, he's a traveler. Abraham's activities in the land of Canaan leave no doubt that he was a stranger and a visitor. For example, after his battle with the invading army, he had to report to Melchizedek, the king of Salem, where he paid a tithe of 10% of all the loot which had been recovered. Abraham later had to purchase a plot of land to bury his wife Sarah. He paid 400 shekels of silver for this land, an extremely large amount of money for a small piece of land containing a cave. While the sum was abnormally high, Abraham, as a foreigner, was in no position to haggle. It would seem the activities of Abraham were not the actions of a native, and Abraham lived among the tolerant Canaanites. It was the custom, if not the law of the land, that a stranger or an alien could not own land or property, and this probably accounts for the high price for which Abraham had to pay. The uniqueness of the events of the books of Moses come under critical scrutiny, since there is nothing that cannot be found in the ancient myths and literature of Mesopotamia and the land of Canaan. The exiled Jews had at their disposal a vast store of creation and other myths, wholly unknown to the outsiders, they borrowed selectively from for their foundational stories. For instance, we know that Eden of the Bible was in the river delta region of Mesopotamia, and that the story of the creation of man is a Sumerian account. The story of the ark, the deluge, and Noah came from the Sumerian accounts. The story of Daniel was taken from a North Canaan poem dated as far back as 1500 BC. The Ugarit epic of Crete deals with capture of a bride of a king Kerit by a distant king. It was the source of the stories of Genesis 12 and 20, where twice Abraham had to get his wife, Sarah, back from the hands of other kings. The story of Job came from a Babylonian poem about a virtuous man named Tabu Utel Bal, who was afflicted for some reason and tormented by all the gods. The story of Jonah has multiple origins and apparently was universal, for Hercules was swallowed by a whale, and precisely, at the same damn place. And Persian legends tell of their hero Jamad, who was devoured by a sea monster and later vomited him out safely on the shore. The story of Samson is so strange and foreign to the Hebrew lore that it would indicate that it was borrowed in total from Canaanite mythology. In fact, his name is derived from Shamash, the Canaanite sun god who ruled Lebanon. The first 11 chapters of Genesis are largely set in Mesopotamia. Eden is a Sumerian word meaning step, and was a district in Sumer. The Tower of Babel was in Babylon. The Hanging Gardens of Babylon may have inspired the story of the Garden of Eden. The cuneiform tablets found in Ebla mention the cities of Sodom and Gomorrah and contain the name of David. They also mention Abramu, Abraham, Esau, Esau, and Seolam, which is Saul, as well as a knight named Ebrium, who ruled around 2300 BC, who also bears an uncanny resemblance to Eber from the book of Genesis. As we're told in the Torah, Eber was the great-great-grandson of Noah and the great-great-great-great-grandfather of Abraham. Some scholars suggest that biblical references are obviously overstated because the divine name Yahweh was never mentioned once in any of the original tablets. You think? Israelites were always Canaanites. They never lived or slaved in Egypt, as shown in the Sado history of Exodus, all made up in or after the Babylonian exile. The strongest indication is that the appearance of the seventh-day Sabbath rest commandment the Israelites adapted from the Babylonian Sabbatou. It was even put in the creation story for the creators to observe the seventh-day rest. Now to finish. The Babylonian exile, which was between 586 and 538 BC, and it marks a dividing point in Torah history. The Judaite community in Babylonia was, on the whole, more Yahwehist in religion than ever. They were following the Mosaic law, emphasizing the redefining distinctive elements such as circumcision and the Sabbath. Let me point out that it is possible that they reached an understanding of these older historical events as acts of a universal God. Of course, they're God. Of course. In any event, it was from this community that the leadership and the resurrection of the Judaite nation and the faith were established when Cyrus the Great, labeled the Lord's Anointed, conquered Babylon and made it possible for them to return. A group of about 50,000 persons, including approximately 4,000 priests and 7,000 slaves, returned to Judah, and I'll add with a whale of a tale to teach the next generation.